The topic is Dismantling Encrypted Racism and Celebrating the Achievements of Black People. And I want to look at this topic from a very different viewpoint. I guess for me, I want to look at the topic from the viewpoint of history. And I hope Basil doesn't mind if I do that. And so looking at the topic from the viewpoint of history, I want to look at this parallel of African-American life that can be applied, I'm sure, to so many other parts of the African diaspora, to look at what happens when people who come to or are brought in, subjected to unfairness in any environment, have to achieve under these very harsh conditions, and at the same time have to deal with everything internally that is making them almost pulled apart at the seams. And so what we're dealing with in America is this duality between what the country says it is and what it can be for certain people, and what it's been, and in spite of what it's been for people of African descent, to be able to rise up from there and still achieve a great deal. This morning, and so many times during this week, I've had the opportunity to speak about the first African-American female U.S. Supreme Court Justice nominee. It's been announced last night, and today her name is Ketanji Brown Jackson. And so she is someone who has graduated from the highest universities here, the most prestigious. She's also been someone who has worked in the public defender's office defending poor people who have been accused of crimes. Ketanji Brown Jackson, she's no relation to me. I don't know her personally. I am just proud of the fact that an African-American woman has the potential to be on this nation's highest court. But how could we even get to this point? We had to go through what the song says, and the Black National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing. Here's just one of the part of the lyrics, and you'll better understand why that song is so moving for so many people of African descent. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, thou who has by thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in the path we pray. Because when this song was written, this country was in the midst of lynching. So I'm going to start back to where we think we should always start when we talk about African-American history, and that's Africa. I began with Queen Nzinga, and Queen Nzinga of Angola, who was in Angola, or queen at the time, in what was called Ndongo, until the Portuguese arrived. And first they arrived visiting, then secondly, they arrived to conquer. Why? Because they were given powers by the Pope to go into any nation that was considered a heathen nation, a non-Catholic Christian nation, and subjugate those people for the labor that the old world, France, Portugal, England, and as well as Spain and many other countries of Western Europe were moving into North and South America. And they decided they would go into these lands and we subjugate you in the name of the king or the name of the queen. This was what was going on in the 1400s, the 1500s, into the 1600s. And so when we have someone like Christopher Columbus, and they talk about Christopher Columbus coming from, representing Spain, and so many others coming from Western Europe, and going into Africa and going into North and South America, it was with the idea that religion, the Pope told them that anyone who was not of Catholic belief could be subjugated and oppressed. So we have a civilization that was already there. We had a king, we have kings and queens, we have a governmental structure that was already there in Africa. We had, of course, Timbuktu and so many cultural languages and traditions and artistry taking place when the European arrived and decided that they would subjugate these people by force, by violence, and then take those people, put them on ships and transport them to another part of the world to work on behalf of that monarch for free. So those people who were of African descent were taken from Africa by force, kidnapped, under gunpoint, that fomenting violence between the different tribes there, so they would attack one another and then take those prisoners of war into North and South America. And so we think about Queen Nzinga, who was a warrior princess and was someone in what is now the Congo and Angola, who fought the Portuguese to try to stop the slave trade. And yes, there were other mechanisms of slavery during that time. We know that there was slavery in Egypt, which the Israelites were enslaved by the Egyptians. We know that the Romans enslaved Christians. We know there had been different types of slavery, but we had not had the type or form of slavery that was decided by the English. The English took people from Africa, from Angola in particular, on a ship that landed in Virginia. So the state of Virginia, which is located in the southern eastern region of the United States. And back then in 1607, Virginia was a colony of England. And so these Africans who arrived in 1619. And we know this because there are many journal articles that are talking from the people who were secretary of that colony at the time in 1619, that there was an arrival of 20 and odd Africans into the colony. So what we have here, 1607, we have an English colony where people have been kidnapped from Africa and brought to this English colony. 1619, we have the Africans arriving into the colony, and 1619 is also when we have the lawmakers creating the laws of the colony. All of this is happening in Virginia in 1619. The reason why this is so important is because the United States takes its time from its inception, from that 1600s period in Virginia forward. That's where United States founding is, in Virginia in the 1600s. It's not Plymouth Rock in Massachusetts, it is Virginia in the 1600s. So what takes place in Virginia in the 1600s sets then the groundwork for what we're wrestling with today. But as I said, we've had Africans who have achieved, and yet they have to balance out the anguish of oppression. These two things are happening all at the same time: achievement and the anguish of oppression. And so achievement, we have Mary and Anthony Johnson, who are Africans from Angola, who have land of their own in the 1600s, that same Virginia colony. They also have servants of their own. They have European and African servants. So these Africans have African and European servants working for them on their farm. And then the lawmakers start to change the laws to undermine the progress of those Africans. And I believe that undermining was due to jealousy, due to a need to compete, and finding that these Africans are competing with them. Even with all of these setbacks, they're competing with the European and being successful. And they're making themselves a place in the society. They are achieving. So this idea of achievement in spite or despite of oppression is something that you see that African Americans are so proud of, that despite of all of this oppression, we continue to achieve. And as soon as Africans achieve something in this country, the rules change. And then the Europeans change the rules. And now we go into another phase in which we have to relearn new rules and try to achieve based on this new terrain. And so they change the laws and say that because you're African descent, because that's it, you're of African descent, you can be made into a perpetual servant, a servant forever, because God said that people of African descent are servants for life. This is how this started. Most people don't understand how enslavement started in this country. Enslavement started in many different ways in other countries, but in this country, this is how it started. But that didn't stop African Americans. Africans continue to achieve. Why? Because we fought against enslavement. Many people, of course, generation after generation, were crushed under it. There were many lives lost. Many people who felt that they had no other choice gave in, but there were so many more who rose up and fought for their freedom. And so we know they fought. We know there were artists like Phyllis Wheatley, who was the first Black poet in the 1700s. We know that there's Sojourner Truth, who in the 1800s walked away from slavery and said, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to be enslaved. And so she actually sued the white people to gain her freedom. And so many people of African descent decided to use the legal system to sue for their freedom. Or you had people like Nat Turner, who rose up in 1831 and had Nat Turner's Rebellion. And he and his men went out and he fought and killed for his freedom. We have Frederick Douglass, who was an enslaved person who ran away, and he represents those people who escaped slavery by running away, and they knew if they were caught, their lives would be taken. So we have those people, and they all represent different aspects of achievement. Frederick Douglass went on to be a great statesman. He, in such an early period of the 1800s, he was known around the world as someone who was standing up for the oppressed, having been oppressed himself as a formerly enslaved person. We have lawsuit after lawsuit that I show in my book, She Took Justice, of Black women from the 1600s, the 1700s, going to court saying, I'm going to sue you for my freedom. I'm not going to be treated in this way. So many people are not used to having heard that African Americans didn't just sit back and allow themselves to be enslaved. They fought back in every way possible. So by the time that slavery ends in 1865, we have these 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And for those people who live in the United States, when you arrive here, you arrive in a nation in which there are many freedoms. Those freedoms came at the price of African American blood, sweat, and tears. And that has to be understood, that this nation is a nation that has had a violent past and a violent present. And in order for African Americans to not just to survive, but to thrive and achieve, it meant that we have to do battle all of the time. Throughout these hundreds of years, African Americans have been on the front lines of forcing this country to represent to represent itself fairly. And in doing so, have to then speak to what the laws say, then apply them to all people, and what the Constitution says, and apply that Constitution to all people. That is why visitors coming from all around the world have their constitutional rights respected. It's because African Americans went to court, protested, and also had legislation passed to force this country to apply the Constitution fairly. And so when we think about those lawyers, like when we think about someone like Ketanji Brown Jackson, who's going to rise to the nation's highest court, we have to also think about the fact that these lawyers, these judges came from somewhere. This was not new. Black female lawyers have been around in this country since the 1800s. The first Black law school was in the 1870s. The first Black female lawyer was in 1872. Her name was Charlotte Ray. That's how long we have been in the practice of law. That's how long we've been fighting using law. We also need to know that Black politicians have been around since the 1870s. The first Black US senator in this country was in 1870. 1870. There were over 4,000 Black men in offices of the US Senate, the House of Representatives, in state government. And what happened? Once we learn the rules, we follow the rules, we begin to achieve, and then there's a backlash. That's what we saw from the 1600s going forward, the backlash. So the Ku Klux Klan, a terrorist organization, killing with impunity because the prosecutors didn't prosecute when Black people and brown people were killed. The prosecutors stood back and let it happen. The judges stood back and let it happen. And so we had to protect ourselves as people of African descent. And we continued to build schools. So we had schools in the 1870s, colleges in the 1870s, the law schools, medical schools in the 1870s, the 1800s, 200 years ago almost. We had all of these things. And what happened? Again, the laws came into play in 1896 with Plessy versus Ferguson. And that law, before South Africa, this country had apartheid. That's where South Africa developed apartheid. They developed it from the United States. The United States created apartheid in 1896 with the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. With that case, all of the United States was segregated by race. White people were all segregated from people of color, and not just African Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, Latin Americans, anyone in this country who was of color. And they used to not even say of color. If you had anybody in your line that was of color, then you were of color. And they called it the one drop rule. That meant that you were white enough to pass. It didn't matter if your grandparent was person of color, of African descent, or Native American or Asian American, then you were considered a person of color. And so now we had to turn around and have African Americans fight again against this color line, this racial apartheid system that had been put in place. And we did. We developed the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. We brought lawsuit after lawsuit. In those lawsuits, many of them were successful. And so we began to vote, of course. And then as Black men voted in 1870, women gained the right to vote in 1920. And what happened? Once again, they changed the rules, tried to take away voting rights. So we had to bring lawsuits, we had to protest. And then, of course, we had lynching. And lynching is something that is so horrific. What we did in this country, what you saw with George Floyd, and we know that film was shown around the world, of George Floyd with someone with a knee on his back, crushing the life out of him in broad daylight in front of people who are witnessing this, filming this. And this police officer, Derek Chauvin, in doing this in front of 3 other police officers until George Floyd's life is taken from him in front of everyone. Why did he do this? How did he think he could get away with killing somebody in broad daylight? Why? Because it has been going on for 300-400 years. Killing people of color with impunity, no prosecution, no arrests, nothing. That has been taking place in this country for as long as the 1600s going forward. That's why he felt he could do this and get away with it. And as you know, if you're visiting this country, you see time and time again, African Americans being gunned down by police officers and having no justice. No justice. And so at the same time this is happening, we still have achievements. We still have people who are working to be better in going to school and going to the sciences and being lawyers and bringing cases. Every aspect of American life, we still have a push for achievement. We have Marian Anderson, who in the 1940s and 50s becomes an opera singer. We have people who are in the arts and sciences. We have, if you've ever seen the film Hidden Figures, the Black women who worked with NASA to make sure that we had our science and the United States went to the moon based on the mathematician genius skills of Black women. All of this is taking place at the same time we have this oppression. Even during World War II, we had segregation of the troops, but we had at the same time the Tuskegee Airmen, who were known for their courage and they're known for their vitality, known for their genius in trying to outsmart the Germans in the air. All of this is taking place in the time period of lynching and oppression. We have Martin Luther King rise up and lead the civil rights movement. We know that there was segregation in every aspect, that apartheid in every aspect of American life. African Americans decided where instead of doing a violent pushback against apartheid, they would do a non-violent pushback. But it also meant so many Black lives were taken for voting rights, for housing rights, for civil rights. Black lives were taken, but the protests continued and people continued to achieve. The reason why that's important is because the achievements made were not just for African Americans. The achievements were made for you. The achievements were made in ways in which the United States not only has to treat its own citizens better, but it has to be a better world citizen. So we then see countries like Ghana rising up for its independence. We see other nations saying, we're no longer going to be under the thumb of our colonists. We're going to rise up and gain our independence. And the African Americans who were a part of pushing back against the United States oppression sent a signal around the world that you should stand up for your rights too. And the reason why it's so important that African Americans be recognized, because African Americans pushing for their rights in a nation that purports itself to be the land of the free, home of the brave, we know that we have to force them to be the land of the free and the home of the brave. We have to force them, and other people around the world said, we're going to force our colonists too. We're going to push back against oppression too. I want people to actually think about what was happening in the United States and how that also had a ripple effect around the world for other people of color around the world to push back against their European oppressors and ask for their freedom, demand their freedom, fight for their freedom as well. And from that, we have the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We have the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is what we fought and died for as Americans here, as African Americans. The 1964 Civil Rights Act said that you cannot discriminate against someone based on their race, their color, their nation of origin, or their gender. Think about that. That was based on the blood, sweat, and tears of African American protests and laws and litigation. That didn't fall out of the sky. That wasn't based on some benevolence from white people. We earned that. We fought for that. We died for that. And so when you come to this country, the reason why you come here with freedoms, you come here with protections, because African Americans created those freedoms, created those protections, and died to enforce them. So when people then talk about African American achievements, they can be seen in something like the rise of someone who is an African-American woman, Ketanji Brown Jackson, but it also must be seen from the little people. No one will ever know their name, who gave of their lives and livelihoods to force this nation to live up to its Constitution, to force this nation to be more than just talk when it talks to the world about peace and freedom and democracy. It forced this nation to stand up for what it claims to be the rights within the U.S. Constitution. And at the same time, every time there's a push forward for achievement in African American life, there's a push back. And we always continue to stand up and say that we are fully human people with intellect and spirit and heart. And we are allies, always searching for worthy allies, with the recognition, with the spiritual belief that God is on our side, that we will continue to push for what is right and what is just. Are we angels? No. Do we have issues in our communities? Yes, we do. But in spite of all of that, we still continue to be champions of justice. And that is an African-American achievement no one can take away. And once you start to read history of this country, true history, you'll see that it's the African-American experience that put the conscience in the Constitution and has forced this country to live up to its ideals. And that achievement is something that happens every day in every way, in which people who are operating under such heavy oppression stand up, keep their back straight, look forward, and try to make future generations have lives better than the ones we're living right now. And with that, I'll stand back and ask if I ask you if you have questions, and I'll answer them as best I can.
Thank you very much, Gloria. It's really amazing listening to you. You talked about a paradox, achievement and anguish. And I just want, I know a lot of people here have many questions, and I'm going to open the floor. And if you have your questions, there is a place where you can raise your hand, and then I'm gonna call you. You briefly ask your question. Do not take much time. We just don't have time. I know so many other people want to ask questions, so ask your question, and then I'm going to ask Gloria to answer your question. So if you have a question, raise your hand, and then I'm going to call you. Judy, go ahead.
Yes, my question is understanding the anguish and understanding the celebration, but how do you actually dismantle what's considered the encrypted racism?
By knowing history. We can dismantle something if we know it exists. If you don't know it exists, you can't dismantle it. And I say that because so many people come to this country from other places and they go, we don't understand. If only African Americans worked a little harder, why do they complain all the time? Why can't they take advantage of all the opportunities that are there? And so if you don't know that the racism exists in this country, then you wouldn't know how to begin to take it apart. So that's first and foremost, and know the history of how long the racism has been here. And it's a racism against the color. It's not just against African Americans. And what we'll find is that you hit a ceiling, and it's a color ceiling. And when you hit that ceiling of color, that you can go so far, but then stop, then you'll see that, oh, so maybe what these Black people were saying is true. I never thought about it like that until I personally experienced it. And so it's difficult then to have allies who will help dismantle something they don't believe exists, and they think that people are just complaining too much. And I'll give this example. Before 9/11, people did not think that there was any prejudice against Muslims. And then after that, you began to see the anti-Muslim sentiment rise to the surface. And now you have to deal with this anti-Muslim sentiment. But if you say, oh, there is none, it doesn't exist. Oh, those people of Muslim, who practitioners of Islam, oh, they're just complainers. There's nothing going on. There's no real problem. And so then you have to say, wait a minute. If you don't at least acknowledge the problem, how are we going to dismantle it? I think that is something that's very important for us to understand. We need to see that there is a problem so we can address the problem. The second part of it is, once we see there is a problem and we begin to address the problem, one way to address it is to say, what role are we playing in the problem itself? And that's what's taking place here in the United States. They have actually passed more than 24 laws to stop teaching any type of history that makes white people feel bad. This is literally, they are passing laws, already passed them, to say if you are teaching any type of history that makes white people feel uncomfortable, you are not allowed to teach it in public schools and in some private schools as well, across the country. Because we know to dismantle racism, you have to say it exists. And so to say that we're not going to teach it, they are actually banning books, history books. My book in certain states, my book would be banned, that you could not teach about racism. You could not teach about this sentiment that's anti-color. And so that's why I say it's so important for us to know it exists, and then to say, how can we see it now in its many phases in modern society? Because so often we're looking for something that's on its face, like, oh, you cannot come into this room, you cannot get this job if you are of this ethnicity, or you are of this race. But they don't put it on its face anymore. Now it's more implicit. Now it's behind the scenes. So you have to understand the vestiges. And those vestiges, what I mean, are the remnants of this historic time. So people are sneaky about it. They don't want you to know we're actually being discriminatory. And so that's why you also have to see how racism and other discriminatory actions play out in day-to-day life. And it does so by making people believe that they have to be on a white standard in order for them to achieve. And that's not true. They should not force people to say that, oh, this, if the lighter you are, the more palatable you are to us in a job. And how do you see this? You see this by having people say, well, all the darker skinned people with natural hair are not going to get the job, and only jobs go to the lighter skinned people with straight hair. This plays out in many different ways in which you see how racism will play out in a society or in a job. And so it's for people who say, I've heard them talk about others, but I never thought they'd talk about me. If they're talking about a particular group in a disparaging way, then those people are practicing a form of discrimination that will be practiced against others as well. Don't think that just because they're not talking about you, that they're not going to be discriminating against you in the future.
So can I just do one short follow-up?
Go ahead.
It appears to me that, like you mentioned, that there are lots of different laws. And it seems as if the laws work when it applies to everybody else. But when the laws are supposed to help, people of color, they're actually ignored. The laws are there. People say things, words are written, right? So we all see the big signs that the corporations are doing or that the law puts out there, but they're ignored. I mean, it's great to have the stuff documented, but if nothing happens to actually help people, then I'm not sure if we can dismantle it. It seems that we have to go around it and continue to achieve.
With both of those ways, up, around, through, force it down, all of those things happen at the same time. Dismantling, when you see a building being dismantled, they don't use just one mechanism to dismantle. They can tear it down, they can go in, they can knock out the walls, they tear it down little by little, and then they'll bring a truck and then they'll take it away. There are so many ways to dismantle, and each one of us has our own unique characteristic, our own unique quality that would allow us to play a role in dismantling it. And yes, law does work if we're championing some law, when we're forcing laws to actually do what it's supposed to do. But you can also pay money, if you say, look at it that way, donate to organizations that are bringing these lawsuits, because these lawsuits become very expensive. But also pay attention and send that letter to the editor, right? Call that congressman. Every individual person has a role they can play in dismantling racism.
Thank you. Abdullah Halim.
Thank you. Thank you, Gloria, for this interesting presentation. I want to ask you about this situation of the African American in the United States. How do you explain why until this century, the African American people still live injustice and discrimination in the different institutions of American society? Is there a political problem or legal problem?
Let's put it this way. As I said, you've got two different things happening at the same time. You have an achievement. I'm a professor with a law degree. I'm a full professor on my job. I'm a writer of books and plays. I've achieved a great deal, but I don't know when I leave my home if I'm going to be killed by police. Those two things happen at the same time. So not all people of African descent live in poverty. More white people live in poverty than Black people. Okay, more white people live in poverty in the United States than do Black people. But here's the problem. Poverty among people of African descent is crushingly harsh. Unemployment is crushingly harsh on people of African descent, but you have many people who are also employed as well. So discrimination has been fought, but every time we fight it, going back to that question that was stated earlier, every time we fight it, they change the rules. And you see that internationally. You see that when it happens in other countries, the United States will say, this is what we want from you. And then they'll change the rules as soon as you start to do it. So this change back and forth again and again, African Americans will say, okay, we're going to get our education. They'll turn around and say, well, now you're overeducated for the job. There's always some way, because it's about competition. There's competition of white Americans against people of color. Not just African Americans, but many people of color. And so white Americans want to stay on top, and they'll keep changing the rules, divide and conquer, and do whatever is necessary to stay on top. I'll tell you, last weekend, I had a chance to talk with people about critical race theory, and a white gentleman in the audience, and I asked him, what is this with whiteness? Why is it that all your power you've put in being white? What is that about? And he said, it gets me things. That is a quote. He said, it gets me things. And so when you think about this idea of whiteness, who's going to give up this power if it gets them things, if it puts them on top and keeps them there. So they are using laws again and again each time Black people achieve. And I'll give you an example. Barack Obama, first Black president of the United States, 2 terms in office. What did we get from Barack Obama? Donald Trump. Now do you see what I mean? It's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Again and again, as people of color push forward, the backlash comes in and they say, oh no, we don't want you getting that far, that fast. You're achieving too much, slow it down. And then you start to see Black people being gunned down in the street. You start to see what happened with George Floyd. You know, every time there's Black achievement or achievement by people of color, then you see a backlash to undermine that achievement. So it's not that these things are not happening. There is achievement. Their people are not oppressed to the point they were during enslavement or during apartheid. But as you know, in South Africa, as you know, in North Africa, as you know, in so many other places, in England and other places, there's still that colonialist hand that plays a role within the country. So even when you advance, there's that hand that comes and pulls you back. And whether or not it foments conflict between groups, or whether or not it's undermining the power, or putting puppets in place, you know, to undermine the power, as soon as you begin to achieve a level of independence, there is a backlash. And that's what we experience in the United States as African Americans.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gloria. Any more questions? If you have a question, you can raise your hand. Yes, Paul, go ahead.
You're muted.
Can you hear me?
Hear you loud and clear right now.
All right, okay. What about doing through education from a young age, from a primary age? Can you not adjust the attitudes of people in the long term by doing it through an educational process within the school setting?
Thank you so much. And that is what was attempted. During apartheid, remember that started in 1896. That's when our apartheid started. That was before South African apartheid. So what they did, the first thing they attacked were the schools for people of color. They
but if you take history to one side, because I go into schools now, I mean, it's gone the other way in England to a certain degree. My daughters go to quite a high-end school, and now what they're teaching the girls now, or the classes, is that they shouldn't have white privilege. That's the latest thing that's coming out now. Unfortunately, there's one Black child in my daughter's school, in the whole school, so that they come from a prominently white area. But fortunately, because they've traveled around the world and they've met a lot of different people, and that's given them a good balance. But my argument would be, and I have this with a lot of teaching staff that I speak to, they should be teaching this from or teaching that there is no color, it's just people. Do you know what I mean? And I know how difficult that will be, because I worked in America and I was gobsmacked at the racism within the police service against their own people, against other police officers that were non-white. It really threw me, and that was many years ago. But I just don't understand why they haven't got that in schools over in America now, where they're trying to teach this from ground level. Does that make sense?
To teach what, though? That's what I'm...
Well, to teach that, like I do a lot of gang interventions. So they're starting to do that now from the ages of about 8 or 9.
Paul,
yeah, go on.
Paul, I'm missing this, okay, because I know we don't have a lot of time.
Yeah.
Okay, are you talking about teaching history?
No, I'm talking about teaching from, right, take history to one side. I'm talking about teaching from now, from today, going forward, that they should teach this, that people are just, it's just a people, you know. I mean, in UK, I think there's still a long way to go, but
I'll tell you this. I have a friend who's in the UK. I just talked to him 2 days ago, and people of color, people of African descent in the UK are oppressed as well.
Yeah. Further down, in London areas, yeah.
Yeah. So, but if you help me have one Black child in this whole school, then, you know, it's very difficult for that Black child. I'm just going to say, as somebody who was one of 4 Black kids in a white school, is a very difficult thing to do, you know, so.
Yeah, I understand that. I do understand that. But what I'm saying is, even in London, I go to London, I visit London schools, and it's multi-ethnical. I mean, there's lots that it's not just Black. There's Asian children, there's Indian children, there's, you know. So I think from what they're trying to do, certainly in the schools I visit, is they're trying to take it forward from today, and so look, you know, we need to. Everybody needs to. I know it sounds a bit softer, but everybody needs to get on. I don't understand. I mean, in America, I don't know how.
But that's why I'm trying to explain to you, Paul, that you can't go from today forward like nothing happened, because we're.
Yeah, I do understand that.
Okay, then if we cannot do that, then that's not the way you dismantle racism. You don't pretend that nothing happened. It's like being in an abusive relationship and pretend that the abuse never happened. It's like, let's start from today and go forward. So that's not the way that we can solve a problem. You can have truth and reconciliation and say, based on truth and reconciliation, let's go forward. But you can't just have the victims or the people who are oppressed and the people who are benefiting from the oppression say, let's go forward from here, because then you've locked into place the system that was already here before that one day. So if we start today, Saturday, and say today, Saturday, we're going forward from here, we've locked into place everything that's happened up until this day. So then that's not a way to dismantle racism from my perspective. We have to be fully aware of what has taken place in this world, and then say we've got to dismantle what's here and look at injustice as something that cannot go forward the way it is now. But to say it can't go forward the way it is now means we have to acknowledge and be aware of what has happened in the past.
All right, thank you very much, Gloria, and thank you, Paul, for that important question.
Thank you.
I know, Reverend Sharon, I know you have a question. I see your hand is raised there, but I want to call on Alex. Alex is asking a question. Alex, could you ask that your question to Gloria? Alex?
Yeah, my question is, what are your thoughts on the possibilities of using restorative practices to address historical injustices?
I think that would be an excellent method, one of the methods to use. And as we said before, when people tear down a structure, a building, they don't use just one method. They use many different methods. You have things that are hands-on. You have things that are big machinery. You have, you know, that all are part of dismantling something that's in place. So I think, you know, restorative justice would be excellent. I think also going back to truth and reconciliation, mediation, that's one of the reasons why I took the mediation course at ISERM, because I wanted to have more tools in my toolbox so that I'm interacting in these different environments. I want to be able to use all of the possibilities to help dismantle something that is harming all of us. And there's a saying that you can't hold me down with your foot on my neck without you staying here with me. And I think that's what stopped America from growing, spiritually growing culturally, because it can't keep people in one place and keep going forward. You know, so as it's stuck with this issue of race that it won't deal with, and as was pointed out in other countries, in Canada and the UK, there's still issues, but people actually acknowledge that we have a problem. And this country refuses to acknowledge that the problem even exists. And so, and then to pass laws to say that you can't even talk about the problem. And you can't talk about it in a place like school. And going back to K through 12, going back to our school system of young people, it was Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 that desegregated our schools from apartheid. And the backlash from that was lynching, of brutality, assaults on people, and this push against Black children, other children of color attending the white schools, and of white children attending those Black schools. And so if you have one Black child in a school, that's traumatic. To be one Black child in a completely white school, they might have the benefit of the education, but they're also taking on a lot of trauma for being that one Black child. So we need to have a critical mass of people who are willing to accept that we're all human. Yes, we all are human, and we need to move forward from here but not as they say in Animal Farm, some people are more equal than others. We're all equal, but some are more equal than others. I mean, that's the way the system is set up at present. Sharon? You're on mute.
Here you go.
Okay.
I just wanted to comment, Gloria, about what you said regarding history and how it's so important to acknowledge what happens in the past, because if we are not aware of it, we're going to repeat it. So it's imperative that we know the history so that we can move forward in a way that is healing. But my question is, what are your thoughts around the controversy of affirmative action?
I think, affirmative action under law was something that was created to affirmatively address the discriminatory actions, the violence, the laws that were in place to oppress people of color, and especially African Americans. And that was started in the 1970s. And then by the early 1980s, it was almost dismantled, because this idea of affirmative action benefited more white women overall, because white women used affirmative action because affirmative action said that we wanted to lift oppressed people, and that included women at the time. And so it was people of color as well as women. And so white women were beneficiaries of affirmative action. And so you don't even hear about that. You only hear about people of color. But I think the fact that in other countries it's called positive discrimination, in which there are, whether or not it's based on race, it could be tribal delineations, it could be based on religion, in which certain groups of people have been oppressed over time by law and society. And so efforts are made by the government to address those historic oppressive mechanisms and help those people then rise up. In this country, affirmative action means, for the most part, that Black people are getting something they don't deserve. And when you think about even Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, she's a graduate of Yale Law School. She clerked for Stephen Breyer on the U.S. Supreme Court, our nation's highest court. She has worked as a judge in district court and as appellate court. Her credentials are even better than, by far, than the white female U.S. Supreme Court justice who just rose up to take her seat on the bench. And yet they're calling her an affirmative action hire. So you see how they throw this mud of affirmative action on anything that people of color do, to say that, well, the only reason why you have this job is because you're Black. And you look at this, no matter how qualified, overly qualified a person of color is, there's always this sense that we can just throw this mud on them that it's affirmative action. Yet at the same time, the need for affirmative action for positive discrimination is necessary, because the oppression of the past is still taking place in the present with the undereducation of Black children and brown children in our communities. And so many of our children have to go to private schools in order to gain a good education, because the public schools are so underfunded, especially if those public schools are in areas with a high population of people of color.
Thank you, Gloria. Judy, it seems you have another question, but I just want to make sure there is not a person who has got a question to ask Gloria. Judy, I'm going to ask you to go ahead.
Thank you. So, Professor, what do you see then as the fallout as we approach again, or are actually in another period of regression? In terms of the education, where they're banning history, politics, where the representation now is way over on the other side, the non-progressive side, and voting rights are being taken away, and votes will possibly be counted in a way that we shouldn't be counting them.
Then now you see visibly, all of you see what African Americans have been facing for hundreds of years. What we see that's made so evident is the battle that we have before us, but it's not a new battle. So we use litigation, we use protest, we use the changing of the laws. We have to keep doing what we continue to do and come up with ways to do it with social media, with new technology. We have to become more creative. But what I think is fascinating about this is that now the world can see what we've been battling for hundreds of years. The same country that says it's a shining light on the hill of democracy turns around and takes away voting rights. The same country that talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of justice will gun down a person who's unarmed on the street and then not even prosecute the people who do it, not even have a trial for them to explain why you took that person's life. This is what we're battling against in this country, and I'm glad now at least the world can see and better understand why we have such pride in our achievements, because it's come at such a high price and over so many obstacles. Now, perhaps you can better understand when people negate the cry of the African American about the pain of injustice in this country, what that injustice looks like, and why the pain is so deep, because in the same country that is allowing people, certain people, to rise up, it's saying, yes, but you can only rise up so far, this group over here. And then you make us look bad because we believe that all accomplishments should be by white people and not by other people of color. These differences in treatment under law and in society is what, these differences are what we've had to face for hundreds of years. And that's why we want the respect to understand that as we fight our battles, whatever gain we make, that gain then goes across the board for everyone. So when we have a positive battle for civil rights by Black people, those benefits are not just for the Black community. Those benefits are for any person of color who arrives in this country. You have now gained something on the backs, on the contribution of people of African descent. And that's why Black History Month is so important, for us to realize that we've had to overcome so much. And when I talked to you about the Black National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing, it was with the idea that it was over. And I go back to that. When we talk about it, we need to know that we talk about the land. Sing us a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing us a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun, let us march on till victory is won. Those are the words of the Black National Anthem of Lift Every Voice. We've not said we can't do this, but we need people to recognize what it is that we've had to do over the years and how hard, how very difficult it's been to make us, to be the people we are, to have the achievements that I so proudly talked about today. And there are so many millions of more, small and large, that we've been able to achieve as African Americans. But just give us the attribution, the credit for having done for this country what it could not do for itself, and making this country a better place for all people who visit. And our fight, one of the things, our fight for freedom in places like South Africa, it was in the United States that we actually went to jail, many people here, fighting to stop apartheid in South Africa. So it's not just what we do in the United States, but what we do and try to send a message to the rest of the world as well, to fight oppression, even when it puts on a face of being about liberty and justice for all, and still have to put on that good fight.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gloria. Because of time, I will just ask you one question. If I want to buy She Took Justice, where can I get it?
Thank you so much. Well, if you want to buy She Took Justice, then you can buy it on Amazon and all those places, but you can also buy it on the site Routledge.com, because it's published by an English publisher. And if you go to the site of Routledge, and I'm going to put it, it's like you can find it. I should have done this ahead of time, right? Routledge.com, and then you can go to that site, and on Routledge will give you the if you could find that, and that's Routledge. And on the site, if you go on the site itself, and I put it in the chat, the Routledge.com site, you can find the book there, and you can get 20% off. And you can have 20% off, and I'll give you the secret code. It's FLR40, and that will give you the discount code for 20% off of She Took Justice. So FLR40 gives you a discount code, 20% off, and the book is $19.95, but you'll get 20% off on the Routledge site only. You could always go to Amazon, but that's the site that will give you the 20% off using the discount code.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate this opportunity. I'm gonna get a copy hopefully this week. Yeah. Thank you. I just want to use this opportunity to inform everyone that we are hosting a conference, our international conference on ethnic and religious conflict resolution and peace building. It is scheduled for September the 28th through September 29th. It's going to be in the Westchester area. So the call for papers is already on our website. If you want to send your abstract or a paper, you can send it, read the call for papers and send the abstract to us. We also have, as Gloria said, we have a mediation training. It is a specialized type of mediation where we train people to become ethno-religious mediators. So if you want to participate in one of our training sessions, you can find that information on our website. Reverend Sharon, do you have something else to say?
I just want to thank Gloria for this wonderful presentation. It's been so enlightening for me personally, because a lot of the things that you mentioned, I had no clue about. And I've grown up here in New York, and we had Black history, but never so in depth. So I look forward to reading your book, and thank you. So I just wanted to share that.
I thank you too. And I just want to say, so much that was done non-violently. So the efforts was, the efforts to get equality in this country were non-violent efforts, and people died, because they were non-violent. And so I want us to go back to that question. We're going to use everything we can to make sure that we have equality in this country for all people. And that's what's so important. That's what the African-American fight represents, is that we all people should be equal. And I thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure and honor.